What's up, Ego Hackers? It's Chase of csjoseph.life doing another episode for Season 17. This is Episode 6. Who are the Alpha Quadra, aka the Crusaders? Before we get into this lecture, I'd like to remind everyone that Season 21, Episode 17 just dropped. That's How to Social Engineer INFPs, the final episode of Season 21. And you can listen to that or watch that here on the YouTube channel or also on our podcast, which is at csjoseph.life/podcast. I highly recommend you guys check that out. It is a bit of a longer lecture, but it also has an attached Q&A at the end. So if you guys want to watch it all the way through, it'll definitely be worth it. Anyway, moving on to this lecture, welcome to the first episode where we talk about the four quadras. The four quadras are another vector with which you could utilize to identify types using the type grid. The type grid traditionally, people have been using interaction style, aka communication style, or temperament, aka disposition or cognitive axis analysis. But this particular vector, which is like the third or fourth vector, I don't know what we're officially calling it, but this particular vector for using the type grid could help you eliminate up to 12 of the types after identifying a person's quadra. In order to identify a person's quadra, all you have to do is perform cognitive axis analysis to figure out, if they're an SI plus NE user or a SE plus NI user for their perception functions. And then for your judging functions, you decide if they are a TEFI user or if they are a TIFE user. Combine their perception function with the judging function set within cognitive axis analysis, and the output is a quadra. Once you identify a person's quadra, you've just eliminated 12 of the types on the type grid, and then you could proceed with temperament / dispositions or interaction / communication styles to be able to determine which type somebody is with 100% accuracy. But anyway, in order for us to get to that point, let's actually talk about the nature or the behavior of the Alpha Quadra, aka the Crusaders, according to the theory. Now, I do have to give credit where it is due. This particular theory comes from Socionics. I am not the biggest fan of Socionics, but Socionics has a very, very large amount of very useful information, and I'm just cherry picking the pieces of Socionics that I think are the most relevant and the most accurate. The rest of it I'm not really utilizing because it's not really necessary to do so, or it's flat out incorrect. I've talked about how Socionics may teach people to get into relationships with their duals or their conflict types, etc. And when it comes to compatibility, I am very against Socionics' approach and recommendations to compatibility for intimate relationships. That being said, Socionics also has a lot of value to add when it's talking about the roles of various types to one another. Like, for example, I'm an ENTP, and the pedagogue type to the ENTP is the INFJ, because the INFJ exists to teach the ENTP, but also vice versa. The ENTP exists to teach the INFJ. So those are just some really the good things about Socionics, but part of Socionics we have the four quadras. And one thing to note about the four quadras is that initially the four quadras definitely, what's great about the quadras is that each there's four types per quadra, so there's four quadras times four types, so 16 of the 16 personality types, of course. But within each quadra, the types are eerily similar, and the reason why is because they have the same four cognitive functions within their ego, within their cognitive function stack. So let's use an example here on this whiteboard. If we'll just take a look. So notice we have this four-piece little grid. We have the ESFJ Cavalier, the ENTP Rogue, the ISFJ Knight, and the INTP Ardent. Each of these four types belong to the Alpha Quadra, or what I like to call the Crusaders. The Crusaders each have extroverted feeling, introverted sensing, expert intuition, and introverted thinking cognitive functions, within the top four slots of their cognitive function stack, and they are all within their ego. So that basically means effectively these four types are basically, they think the same way. They have the same, very, very similar nature. It's just that they have different priorities and different awarenesses or levels of awareness within each of their cognitive functions. They're afraid of things differently. They're stronger in certain areas. They're more responsible in certain areas. And they're very childish in different areas. And then obviously this affects the rest of their four sides of their mind per type within the alpha quadra. So look a particular example of that. If you notice, each of the four types within the alpha quadra have a different hero function, with the ESFJ having the FE hero, then the ENTP having the NE hero, the ISFJ having the SI hero, and the INTP having the TI hero. So each of the individual cognitive functions within a quadra becomes the hero of each individual type of the four types within a quadra. Now remember, folks, when we're talking about quadras, quadras themselves are not the same as the four sides of the mind, as some people have called them. Like, oh yeah, I'm an ENTP, so, my quadra contains ISFJ, INTJ, and ESFP. No, 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 no. Your four sides of your mind are not the same thing as your quadra. That's completely different. Your quadra is the other three types that share the same cognitive functions that you do. It just may be in a different order or in a different awareness within their cognitive function stacks within their ego. I just want to make that very clear before we continue. It's absolutely critical that we know that. So anyway, but let's continue. What is the purpose of the alpha quadra? What's the point of them? And why is it necessary to know them? Like we just said, it's important to identify a person's quadra, because if you're typing them from a type grid standpoint, you can eliminate 12 of the 16 types off of the type grid, and then get them down to just 4 types basically. And you can see examples of me doing this in the How to Type live streams, but I haven't exactly explained, how I arrived at those conclusions until now. And this is why we have season 17, episode 6. It's also important to realize that I'm doing these episodes for season 17 specifically to kind of lay down a foundation for when we talk about cognitive development in children, and then ultimately parenting, etc., which I believe is the rest of season 17. And then we're going to do a deep dive into cognition under season 18, which is cognitive mechanics. But we can't exactly talk about cognitive mechanics until we've first done, the quadras and kind of fleshing out a little bit about socionics before we continue deep into the weeds. We need to look at the forest first. I mean, think about it. We're like literally in a helicopter right now, whereas we're singing the song, loving the smell of napalm in the morning, and then checking out the fact that there's a very nice forest of quadras and socionics and whatnot before we get really deep on the ground in the jungle of cognitive mechanics. We talk about cognitive orbit and cognitive axis and cognitive focus and all these different other concepts that really get into the weeds and really the details of the human mind. But first we have to look above that, kind of get a bird's eye view so we can get our little plan of attack here before we move forward into that much more rich content, I guess, in terms of understanding how four sides theory works, and before we move forward with that. So anyway, welcome to the Alpha Quadra, aka the Crusaders. And what is the Alpha Quadra and their purpose? Well, basically, the Alpha Quadra is where you have knowledge and endurance and perseverance. It's where they meet. Another way to look at this is like, it's where faith and truth combine to create justice, basically, or fairness. And one of the big principles and life lessons of this particular quadra is that SFJ NTP quadra, which is the alpha quadra, this particular quadra is basically obsessed with fairness, absolutely obsessed with fairness. You could even argue in some cases these four types worship fairness, or they make everything to be as fair as possible. Everyone's heard the old adage, life is unfair, but the reality of the situation is that life is actually very fair because these four types make it fair, or they're able to use their extroverted intuition functions to intuitively figure out that yes, actually, logically speaking, through their awareness of logos and extrovert intuition, when their NE and their TI combined, they come to realize an absolute truth about the universe, and that is, quite frankly, life is fair. Now, I recognize I've just triggered the entire audience by saying that life is fair, but it actually really is fair. And one of the reasons why, myself as an ENTP and an NTP and having an ISFJ subconscious and being a member of the Alpha Quadra or the Crusaders, I realized that in order for me to actually forgive myself and not walk around carrying this huge burden of guilt on my back like I do often with my FE child, I am able to let go of that guilt because I have that still small voice inside of me telling me, hey, by the way, Chase, just so you know, nobody is innocent. Because these four types are all about protecting the innocent, or it's all about coming to the aid of the innocent. Innocence is super highly valued by SFJ NTP Quadra. In fact, they're actually attracted, even sexually attracted, to people who maintain their innocence. And that's why they set up intimate relationship with adults that they see still have an aspect of innocence about them. And that's why these types typically end up in relationships with FI users, because FI users seem more innocent than fellow TI users. Something for you folks to remember in terms of innocence. And of course, the most innocent looking of all the types are, you guessed it, INFPs, with ENFPs, followed around them. It's interesting how that works, right? Also, but to these types, ISFPs are super innocent. ESFPs, I think it's the Gamma Quadra, SFP, NTJ Quadra are very innocent looking to the SFJ NTP Quadra. So anyway, but these types, they're all about long lasting. They're all about having endurance and getting through things and gritting their teeth and just surviving. These types are the survivors. They are all about survival, not so much about thrival. They learn how to survive first, and everything is about survival before they can actually really begin to thrive. And one of the reasons why is that if you actually notice something about the Alpha Quadra, about the Crusaders, is that they always have to have some kind of crusade or be on a crusade of some kind. And the reason why is because they have this weird normalcy bias about them, this normalcy bias that basically it gets them to a point where if they don't have some kind of adversity in their life, it's like, okay, there's something wrong. Which it's really actually hard to get SFJ, NTP Quadra, or the Alpha Quadra to accept being happy, because they're so used to reality sucking so much for them that they have a hard time, accepting, a form of happiness, right? And it's because they're always waiting for the next shoe to drop, or when's the next catastrophe that I'm going to have to endure. It's because these types are built to have such a high, strong faith that they can literally endure anything, with the ISFJ being the one that can endure the most, or the ENTP with ISI aspirational being able to endure just as much, if not more, when compared to the ISFJ's SI hero, right? And that's the reason why. It's because they have faith. But what do they put their faith in? They put their faith into the truth, aka logos. So when you have faith and truth combined, you get this quadra, you get these four types, and you get their ultimate purpose, which is to bring about a fair and just world. Fairness and justice is everything to these types. So since we're talking about similarities, let's talk about a little bit more about how they're similar. So both these types have TIFE and SINE within their cognitive axis analysis. So they have the axis of TIFE for their decision-making functions, and they have SINE for their perception or information gathering functions. And these two cognitive axes combine and equal SFJ NTP Quadra, aka the Alpha Quadra, aka the Crusaders. Now, because they're all SI users, if they were going to have like a magic attached to them, using this kind of like Dungeons and Dragons-esque, lore or formula, etc., they would be basically, or using Avatar, the Last Airbender type of, they would be earthbenders, basically. because it's all about introverted sensing. They are trying to be the immovable object, right? That is introverted sensing. That's basically the Earth. And mostly the SFJs are more of the earth-bending, immovable object approach. Whereas the NTPs, they rely more on extrovert intuition, which is the cognitive function that is attached mostly to water. And they can actually assume formlessness. And if they need to harden up, then they become chilled to the bone, cold as ice, such that their water becomes as hardened as ice, and it's extremely hard to break and extremely heavy a burden based on all of the knowledge that they're able to gain within the water. And I guess if you're going to look at astrological signs, you'd think the Aquarius, the water bearer, the bearer of knowledge, that's NTPs basically. Well, guess what? SFJs have NTPs inside of them, and as much as NTPs have SFJs inside of them, in terms of their ego, subconscious relationships, psychologically speaking, that they all have those relationships with earth and water. So if you look at it in terms of what is the magic behind the SFJ NTP Quadra, it's earth and water. Whereas you would say the NTPs are more water benders, whereas the SFJs are more earth benders, for example, using that avatar example. So, and also if you look at virtue and vice, you have faith versus fear, caregiving versus caretaking, sincerity versus insincerity, and apathy, vice of the INTP, for example, giving all of their attention or being completely apathetic. These virtues and vices all apply to every member of the SFJ NTP Quadra, all of them. A lot of people, and this is one of the reasons why, especially when you're looking at caregiving versus caretaking, which is probably the virtue and vice set that most represents the manipulation known as the covert contract, these types, out of all of the types, covert contract people the most. And it's more like, hey, if I scratch your back, then you have to scratch mine, although I never actually told you that has to be. So I end up having in coaching sessions, when I'm talking to SFJ, NTP Quadra, or people within my own Quadra that I'm coaching, I have to remind them to not be covert contracting people or having a covert contract with life. If you would like a good source to utilize for covert contracts, I recommend reading Dr. Robert Glover's book, No More Mr. Nice Guy. This is important for men and women to read. It's important for men to read so they can hold themselves accountable. It's important for women to read to be able to hold men accountable. And also give a nice rubric to women as to how good men should behave so women don't find themselves in relationships with weak men. But interesting to note, Dr. Robert Glover is an ENTP like me, so no wonder he's talking about covert contracts within his book. However, his book definitely affects all men, and I highly recommend that as a resource. So also, another thing that they're similar is that all of these types, they're all informative. And remember, when you're informed with your speech, you're kind of being indirect. You're not choosing how you communicate with people. You're not choosing to choosing your position in the conversation. Someone who's indirect, kind of like Bruce Lee saying, who was Bruce Lee, who was also Alpha Quadra, he was Crusader, let your opponent come at you and then redirect their force back at them, etc. And that's all about being indirect, and kind of more of the yin. These types end up lending themselves more closer to the yin and not so much to the yang. Yang types are more NI users, NISE users, whereas yin types are more NE users, NESI. Although SI itself has a yang attached to it, so you could argue that the SFJs are more yang oriented because introverted sensing is more yang. But then the NTPs are more yin because extrovert intuition is more of a yin-related cognitive function. So there is still a yin and yang equilibrium balance within this quadra in as much as there is with the other quadras. Something to remember. Also, all these four types are systematic, so they are committed to doing the best way of doing something. And when they're doing the best, they end up putting their faith into a system, but what happens when they put their faith in the wrong system? We'll talk about that in a second, and it can have disastrous effects. But they're all about basically having that faith. And if their faith is weakened, well, then there goes their loyalty, there goes their steadfastness, there goes their perseverance, and then they just kind of fall away. It's kind of interesting, how these types have that point of view. And like I said before, they put their faith in fairness, faith in justice, and justice itself is a system because they're systematic, because these four types are committed to doing the best way of doing something, right? So how are they different? Well, they're SFJ, NTP Quadra. SFJ is opposite to NTP. So wait a minute, there's some opposition there. While these types are extremely similar, and while these types have the same cognitive functions, these types are actually usually completely opposed to one another. Why is that? Well, they have introverted thinking. They're all trying to get each other to, you put them all in a room, they're all trying to get each other to listen to each other, and no one's willing to listen to anyone. Everyone's trying to be the person listened to, but then no one else is willing to listen. And then they call each other out as being unfair for not listening. It's so hypocritical. You want to expose SFJ NTP Quadra's hypocrisy? Put them in the same room as another SFJ or NTP. You'll see that hypocrisy come out real quick, especially when you put an NTP in the presence of another SFJ. They'll be pointing their fingers at each other before long, and it's like, wait a minute, can you guys not hear yourselves? It's true, I do it all the time. I'm actually very guilty of it myself, let's be honest. So they have the same goal of justice and fairness, but they oppose each other's points of view as to how to get there. Because everyone within their own quadras, so the Crusaders here in this case, the Crusaders are like, hey, I know the best way on how to run a crusade. No, they don't. Well, wait a minute. To them, they do. So this is why it creates a lot of conflict and competition. While they are comrades, they are not compatible with one another because they have the opposing points of view of how to achieve fairness and how to achieve justice. They have different definitions of fairness. They have different definitions of justice and how to get there, which is why there's conflict created between people within their own quadra. This is why I do not recommend people who are in relationships with their same quadra be in intimate relationships with their same quadra, as well as like business relationships too, at least in terms of business partners. I don't recommend it. I seriously don't recommend it. And remember, this quadra, especially sexually speaking, they like to receive an experience in bed. They kind of like want to be the canvas with which the SE user paints upon. What happens if an SFJ marries an NTP, which is actually really common in people's youth for some reason? Then they get super loyal to one another, and then they're not going to break apart due to that loyalty complex that they have, putting their faith in the wrong thing. But the thing is what happens when you have in the bedroom two canvases and no painters? What happens in the bedroom when you have two painters and no canvases? It sucks. It doesn't make for a very good, loving, intimate, intimate relationship. Apparently Siri wanted to join in on the video as well. So they have the same goal, yet oppose each other. And while they are fellow soldiers in the trenches, they're basically nothing more than comrades. So if the SFJ NTP Quadra can come together basically on two things, and that is for mutual benefit in terms of learning from one another and becoming each other's teachers to help each other become better alphas, better crusaders basically, or when they're all in the trenches fighting against the same obstacle or the same enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend type of approach. That's really the only way to get this quadra to, behave with one another and be with one another as a result. So it just really goes to show, that while people have the same cognitive functions in their function stack, it's not exactly ideal. This is another reason why I have such a huge problem with Socionics, because, where the quadras, come from, is that Socionics would be like, yeah, be in a relationship with your dual, be in a relationship with your conflict type, and it's like, no, don't get in a relationship with those people because you're basically screwing yourself over. That's not appropriate. And this is why I maintain that camaraderie is definitely not something that you would want for an intimate relationship. If you want to find out more about intimate relationships, I recommend you read or watch or listen to Season 5 on cognitive synchronicity here on this YouTube channel. Just go to playlist, go to Season 5 and watch it. Also Season 4, which is how do intimate relationships actually work, another playlist on this channel. And also Season 14, which is available out for our Patreon Gold tier members at patreon.com/CSJoseph. So anyway, So let's move on. So what are the strengths of the Alpha Quadrant? What are the strengths of the Crusaders? Well, they all wield what I call the icy sword of truth. Not necessarily the fiery sword of truth. The fiery sword of truth, and I have said it before because TI by itself is a fiery sword. But look at it this way. Introverted thinking as logos, it's a sword. And your tongue is the sword. And it's the tongue of logic, basically, and giving people a tongue lashing. And it's a double-edged sword. The sword will cut you in as much as it will cut the other opponent. But instead of it being, ablaze with fire, it's actually cold as ice. And when you cut somebody down where they're using the harsh truth of TI as a crusader, you're actually slowing down your opponent and slowing them down and causing them to wait a minute, maybe I should think a little bit. Maybe I should realize that what I'm doing, maybe I'm not doing my duty. Maybe I'm being irresponsible, right? Or maybe I'm going to become unwanted based on the behavior that I'm doing. Maybe I'm actually causing harm to other people. Maybe I am being unfair, right? It's all about slowing down the opponent with truth for that to get them to realize that they shouldn't be so ignorant anymore, right? And this is really important because extrovert intuition combined with introverted thinking, you end up having a vast array of knowledge that you could process with your introverted thinking to be able to provide insight. And it's oftentimes interesting how Crusaders, especially NTPs, are known as, these major intellectuals. It's like they're trying to utilize intellectualism for the sake of fairness, for the sake of justice, to create the ultimate system that's fair for everyone or to increase quality of life, while simultaneously the SFJs are trying to just enforce it. Enforce that system created by the NTPs, basically. And they adopt the system from the NTPs in order to enforce that system. Now, granted, that can have a lot of problems because, oh, wait a minute, they have opposing viewpoints. And it's like, well, the ISFJ looks at the ENTP and it's like, you're nothing more than a disaffected knight. You're willing to harm people, and you're not doing the right thing. Whereas the ENTP is like, okay, hey, the ends justify the means. Which is funny because the ISFJ will hypocritically call out the ENTP for being a bad person because the ENTP's point of view of the ends justify the means, when the reality situation is the ISFJ will be willing to eventually get so down, having a bad day, that they would be willing to behave like super pragmatic, and all of a sudden the ends justify the means. To the point where they're willing to do evil for the sake of good, where they're willing to lie for the sake of telling the truth, which is what ENTPs do on a daily basis. But then the ISFJ, with their more pious approach, with how they act with their faith, etc., would actually end up doing the same thing. It can be pretty unfair, right? So it's funny, when they point their fingers at one another, they're actually being pretty hypocritical. So that's why, if you want to expose someone's hypocrisy, just put them in the same room as people within their quadra. Then all of a sudden, everyone's hypocrisy is going to be shown and exposed. It's very interesting. But the icy sword of truth, why is it necessary? It's because, let's compare the fiery sword of truth versus the icy sword of truth. The fiery sword of truth, it's going to cut and it's going to burn, but those burns heal, right? And they can be some serious burns, but, and it could leave some scarring. But the icy sword of truth, it's trying to leave such permanent damage that it lasts forever, basically. To make a clear surgical cut, it's almost the point of maiming. That's why the truth being spoken by the SFJ NTP Quadra can actually be severely harsh. Because it's said with authority. It's said with the authority of the just. It's said with the authority of what's fair. And, it's like an eye for an eye. Yeah, well, it makes the whole world blind, right? That's the icy sort of truth. It's like, okay, it's cold as ice. You really want to be fair right now? Because you're harming this other person, which gives me license to harm you for the sake of the other person, because you're harming someone who's innocent. You look at it from the ENTP standpoint. The ENTP rogue archetype is literally Robin Hood. He started out as a crusader in the Crusades, fighting the good fight in the Middle East, and then comes back home and robs the rich to feed the poor because the rich have completely neglected the poor while all the Crusaders are away. And he sees that that is unjust and it is unfair. So he thinks it is his duty, for the sake of truth, to do evil for the sake of good, to lie for the sake of truth, in order to get a more freer outcome, right? It's no different than Benjamin Franklin and his influence over the Sons of Liberty, and Samuel Adams in sparking the Revolutionary War to free the colonies from England and England's tyranny. It's the same point of view. So tyranny is everywhere, and the ENTP and the INTP basically lead the charge to get away from tyranny. Well, simultaneously, sometimes the SFJs can get on that bandwagon, or sometimes they could put their faith in the wrong thing and end up actually supporting tyranny. You see what I'm saying? So the more advanced the SFJ is, the more likely they are going to, get away from tyranny. But then at the same time, sometimes NTPs can take it too far with their pragmatism and become that which become tyrants themselves. We see this all the time. I mean, look at Adolf Hitler. He became a tyrant when he was against tyranny. He became a hypocrite, essentially. So it's the same kind of approach, right? So again, their strengths are all about endurance. They can persevere. No one can persevere them. And when it comes to telling the truth, sometimes they can just be as cold as ice because they want to make it so clear-cut that it has lasting, permanent damage, such that, because think about it, when a limb is frozen, etc., and it's completely frozen, and then that hit comes down, that limb comes off, and that's permanent damage. It's not like a burn where the limb would still be there after the fact with the fiery sword. The icy sword, clean cut, it's gone. You are not getting that back. That's cold as ice justice, and that's the SFJ NTP Quadra way of doing things. SFJs, for example, when they get to that mode, they will even sell their own children downriver for the sake of what they perceive is justice. It happens all the time. They will betray their own family in the name of fairness and justice, because if it's fair or if it's just, or if my family member is harming this person, I'm going to be the one to call the police and get them turned in so that they go to jail, so they stop harming other people, even though they're blood related. So at the end of the day, the SFJ NTP Quadra, their true loyalty is not necessarily to their family. Their true loyalty is to fairness, to justice, right? So keep that in mind. Although that sense of justice, well, it can become tyrannical. So how are they weak? What is their weaknesses? Well, like we said earlier, covert contracts, doing good things for other people and expecting something in return, even though we never told those people the good things we're doing them had any strings attached. And it's all about giving with the expectation that you would give back, or you give something and then take it back later, for example. That's a covert contract. And it happens all the time. It's like, it's like, hey, I, like in a relationship, according to Dr. Robert Glover, hey, I did this nice thing for you, so I expect sex in return. That's a covert contract, right? Well, SFJ, NTP, Quadra, the Alpha Quadra, the Crusaders are the most likely to commit the manipulation covert contracts. And it's a serious problem. Something to be aware of. So also, what's interesting about SFJ and NTP Quadra, and here's probably their biggest weakness, is that they can put their faith into the wrong thing. They can put their faith into the wrong system. Remember, while TI is attached to truth or logos or the absolute truth, they're still at the end of the day a processor. And the thing is about TI users is that if you have garbage coming in, you're going to get garbage coming out. And that's just typical of TIFE users. Garbage in, garbage out. And if they are fed a belief system that they believe or were taught or brought up to think was just or to think was fair, they will become the enforcer of that belief system and force that belief system on other people because of their duty to the systematic and the best way of doing something, because they see their belief system or their religion or their spirituality or their faith is the best thing to put their faith into or the best way of doing it. And anyone who doesn't follow that faith or follow this, well, then they're going to be enforced. I've seen Alpha Quadra people do this to people all the time. Why is this happening? Don't forget, folks, you have input, process, output, feedback. TE feeds TI, which creates FE output, which then gives you FI feedback, which leads to more input to start the system over again. Okay? And that's extroverted thinking. The thing is that if there is very low quality input going into the TI user, that leads SFJ and TP Quadra at high risk of putting their faith into the wrong thing. And this could be catastrophic to the point, and I put my faith in the MBTI system. I thought I was an INTJ, and I judged other people in my life as me thinking that I was an INTJ and what they were supposed to do, and giving people the wrong advice and just absolutely being a horrible, terrible person as a result. I regret that, but I put my faith in the wrong system. Or when you're putting your faith into the wrong fad diets, right? How many times does that happen, right? SFJ NTP Quadra is super at risk of putting their faith in the wrong things. And sometimes they get too lazy with their introverted sensing to even use their introverted thinking to actually verify their own belief system. This is a problem, and it's very consistent amongst SFJ and TP Quadra. It gets so bad that even sometimes you get INTPs who are like, I'm not going to put my faith into anything. So they end up being people who believe in nothing, which ends up making them incapable of persevering in anything because they have to put their faith into something in order to persevere, to be able to have that endurance, to utilize, faith and endurance mixed together to achieve great things. And that INTP is not going to be a good achiever because they can't put their belief into anything, because they're too lazy or not willing to take the time to verify any belief systems to come to their own conclusion. The thing is that oftentimes SFJ and NTP Quadra are raised up in belief systems or religions or spiritual institutions or even non-spiritual institutions. They're raised to believe in the medical establishment or the monetary establishment, right? Raised to believe that fiat currency has actual value, right? Or that the FDA knows what it's doing and that they're the experts. It just leads to ignorance. And these types are just as weak to being ignorant as other types. All they have to do is make sure that they are seeking out input, and not input that fits their introverted sensing preference. It also has to be input that completely challenges their core inner belief systems at all times, because they have to be willing to endure and persevere tests of faith. That's the point of the SFJ NTP Quadra. It's all about surviving tests of faith. That's why they're the Crusaders, and having their faith things. Also, another weakness is that if they perceive a lack of justice or a lack of fairness, they'll backstab people. They'll become they will backstab their own family for what they believe is the sake of fairness. And what if they've put their faith in the wrong thing and then they perform a backstab move? They may feel just in backstabbing that person, only to find out that they put their faith in the wrong thing, and then they backstabbed someone for the wrong reason, and now they're a backstabber and a traitor. Horrible. Not something I'd recommend. Or to get even more, their own inner belief systems become so corrupt, and their logic becomes so corrupt because the roots of their logic is completely wrong. So all of their logic, all their thinking is completely wrong. But which introverted sensor, especially SFJ NTP Quadra, is willing to destroy their entire knowledge triangle, their entire belief system, their entire string of logic, and start over and rebuild again? Because that would mean they'd have to take personal responsibility. They'd have to admit that they are wrong. And because they're unwilling to admit that they're wrong, they're actually very arrogant. I even had my wife today tell me to my face that I was arrogant because I was unwilling to listen to her, because I was jumping to the wrong conclusions about what she was saying. She was trying to teach me something, but instead I jumped to conclusions. Instead, I put my faith in the wrong thing. I put my faith in an incorrect belief that I had about her, which had nothing to do on the truth. And I ended up disrespecting her as a result. And then she had to hold me accountable, and I had to take responsibility for my actions. How many SFJ NTP types out there are willing to do that and realize that there is a chance that they've put their faith in the wrong thing? Such that which SFJ NTP Quadra actually allows other people to bring in other belief systems to them, and then they're like, oh, I should learn this to see if this is actually disproves my beliefs. Instead, you have SFJ, ENTP, Quadra, the alphas out there. They're the people who want to burn books because they're trying to preserve and protect, right? Because they see their belief system as being innocently attacked. And then because of that, they stay ignorant. They're the ones who are willing to burn the books. It's really sad when they should be protecting knowledge and being neutral parties, not partial parties. That's one of the big weaknesses of SFJ, NTP, Quadra, is that they can end up protecting the wrong beliefs, the wrong knowledge, and think arrogantly and conceitedly that they are wise when they are actually fools and they don't even realize it. It's like, that SFJ mother sheltering her children and not letting her children watch or read Harry Potter because she thinks it's evil. It's the same concept. When they should actually have an open mind and allow other points of view and other belief systems to get close to hers and maybe even conflict with hers so that her introverted thinking is able to process all of it so that her introverted thinking would be like, okay, hey, maybe they have a point. To be willing to understand that her belief system may not actually be true. This is why I personally apply critical thinking to my own personal belief system. And that, my friends, is the ultimate strength, the ultimate lesson for the Alpha Quadra. It is when the Alpha Quadra acquires critical thinking, because critical thinking is everything. Critical thinking is what prevents SFJs and NTPs from putting their faith into the wrong thing. It is absolutely everything. Because if we put our faith in the wrong thing, not only are we harming ourselves, but we're harming everyone close to us. So folks, if you are an SFJ or an NTP, make sure you are applying critical thinking to everything. That includes the Bible. That includes the Quran, the Upanishads, Confucius, Taoism. It doesn't matter what belief system it is. It could even be the medical establishment. Don't put your faith into the Food and Drug Administration. Are you out of your mind? I don't care how many credentials or how experts it is. Credentials just enable you, the person who should have critical thinking, who should be challenging them, because you are allowing other people to challenge your beliefs. Because if your beliefs are actually true, they can stand up to the challenge. But if you are burning books because you're afraid of being challenged, maybe that fear of challenge is you already recognizing the truth that your belief system is actually a lie. Because if it was the truth, it would be able to stand the test of time, to stand the test of endurance. Because your introverted sensors, all about endurance, right? All about perseverance. How can your belief system handle the test of time? How can it if you're not willing to allow it to be challenged because you're sheltering it and not willing to have critical thinking? Do you know what that means? That means SFJ, NTP, Quadra, you are ignorant and you're harming yourselves and everybody close to you because of it. Take that icy sword of truth and apply it to yourselves, not just to other people, and you'll be far more successful. The greatest strength of SFJ NTP Quadra is critical thinking. Use it, and that icy sword of truth will end up saving lives instead of destroying lives. If you found this lecture useful, helpful, educational, enlightening, please subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. Also, if you want to catch our podcast, go to csjoseph.life/podcast. If you want to join us on Discord to get in on our Q&A sessions and get all the nice little fancy tags, please go to csjoseph.life/social, click on Discord, and join the community. We have over 2,000 people talking about psychology on a daily basis. Active on our server, we know because we prune it all the time, and we sometimes will prune it for the people who are like not active over the last 30 days. And the last time we pruned, we had like over 2,200 people active on the server within the last 30 days. That's pretty nice. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, please join the community. Please get involved. I'm very excited about the second half of Season 17. I hope you folks enjoy it as we continue to talk about socionics, as we are leading up to talking about cognitive development in children. And we'll be doing that here in Season 17, and it will not be behind Patreon. It will be a public lecture. So thank you very much, folks, and thank you all patrons as well for your support. Very much appreciated, as you are literally keeping the lights on. So With that being said, guys, I'll see you guys tonight.